The honourable member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm honoured to be able to rise in this House to speak at second reading in support of Bill S-15, which is the Expansion and Conservation of Canada's National Parks Act. The main purpose of this Act is to legally protect forever the natural and cultural values of that treasure known as Sable Island. And as the title of the Act suggests, Mr. Speaker, through this bill, we are expanding the national park system to conserve Sable Island as our nation's 43rd national park. As anyone who has resided or visited Eastern Canada knows, islands are plentiful throughout this great region. 2 of our nation's 10 provinces are in fact islands, the inspiring rock of Newfoundland and Labrador, and the red sands and green fields of Prince Edward Island. And there is New Brunswick's Grand Manan Island, Cape Breton Island of Nova Scotia, the Magdalen Islands of Quebec, PEI's Lennox Island and Fogo Island off Newfoundland. Each of these and other islands has contributed to shaping the distinct nature and culture of what we call Canada. And Mr. Speaker, over time we have settled and developed these grand islands. We have seized the opportunity to protect the nationally significant landscapes on some of these islands. For example, Gros Morne and Terra Nova National Parks provide an opportunity for Canadians to explore and discover the east and west coast of Newfoundland. Prince Edward Island National Park is famous for its sandy beaches, red cliffs, and the house that inspired novel Anne of Green Gables and protecting the piping plover habitat. This is the world-renowned Cabot Trail that winds through Cape Breton Islands National Park, and our government is working with the province of Canada to assess the potential for a marine protected area in the waters off the Magdalen Island. And now, Mr. Speaker, we're on the cusp of adding that mysterious and far offshore place known as Sable Island to our national park system. I hope that all honourable members will join me in supporting Bill S-15. Throughout this debate, Mr. Speaker, we have heard many testimonies to those natural and cultural attributes of Sable Island that inspires us to add to our national park system. We are impressed by the fact that this island of 30 square kilometres, rising out of the Atlantic Ocean almost 300 kilometres southeast of Halifax, and continues to survive as a shifting sandbar on the edge of the continental shelf. We are inspired that on this island, composed mainly of sand with sparse vegetation, so far from shore, life abounds. 190 plant species, 350 bird species, including the endangered roseate tern and Ipswich sparrow, as well as grey seals and those famous Sable Island horses. We marvel at the attempts made throughout the 1600s and 1700s to settle the island, despite the rough seas, the storms, and fogs that make Sable Island such a hazard to navigation. The more than 350 recorded shipwrecks in this area, Mr. Speaker, stand as a testament to the difficulty in simply accessing Sable Island, let alone trying to settle it. We are hopeful, Mr. Speaker, that in taking action to protect Sable Island under the Canada National Parks Act, future generations will be proud that this House of Commons in 2013 developed, debated, and passed legislation that enabled the protection of this magnificent and mysterious island. Mr. Speaker, as I followed this debate, it appears to me that all parties in the House support the proposal to establish Sable Island as a National Park Reserve. Indeed, many members spoke of the urgent need to get on with the job, as this has been so many years in the making. And it's clear from public consultations undertaken by Parks Canada in 2010 that this support and sense of urgency echoes the passionate views of Canadians and especially Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, establishing Sable Island National Park Reserve of Canada is the right thing to do, and the time to do it is now. I would also observe, Mr. Speaker, a high degree of support for putting in place a legislative ban on drilling from the surface of Sable Island out to 1 nautical mile from shoreline. And I believe that many who have participated in this debate have acknowledged and thanked the petroleum companies like ExxonMobil Canada for amending their existing significant discovery licenses to incorporate this legislative ban on exploratory and development drilling. However, Mr. Speaker, there appears to be one key concern that Bill S-15, and that is the proposal to allow the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board to authorize low-impact seismic activity on Sable Island. I would point out that in reality, The board currently has the authority to permit seismic activity on Sable Island. What S15 proposes is to limit that authority to low-impact seismic activity. In light of this, Mr. Speaker, I would like to spend the next few minutes speaking to this concern. As previous speakers have noted, we are establishing Sable Island National Park Reserve in one of North America's largest active petroleum fields. As we have heard earlier, there is a federal provincial legislative framework in place under the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resources Accord and Implementation Act that administers all petroleum matters in the Nova Scotia offshore. Since 1988, this legislation has taken precedence over all other federal legislation in this region, including the Canada National Parks Act. And as the preamble to Bill S15 makes clear, this legislation will continue to take precedence. Mr. Speaker, in August of 1986, the Government of Canada, the Province of Nova Scotia, signed the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resources Accord. Under the Accord, Canada and Nova Scotia agreed to develop oil and gas in the offshore in a manner that would harmonize the interests of all Canadians with those residing in the province. The Accord called on both parties to pass mirror legislation to create a unified administrative regime for offshore petroleum resources. I repeat, Mr. Speaker, mirror legislation, because this goes to the heart of our deliberations. To give legal effect to the 1986 Accord, both governments passed legislation in their respective legislatures with essentially the same wording. While the names of these bills are a mouthful, Mr. Speaker, for the record, the Government of Canada passed the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resources Accord and Implementation Act, and the Province of Nova Scotia passed the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resources Accord Implementation Nova Scotia Act. And so, Mr. Speaker, you will recall that the Petroleum Resources Accord Act takes precedence over all other acts. Thus, in order to put in place a legal ban against drilling from the surface of Sable Island and to limit potential seismic activity to low impact, both the federal and the provincial Accord Acts must be amended. This fact, Mr. Speaker, has profound implications for our deliberations. On April 24 of this year, the Honourable Charlie Parker, the new Democratic Minister of Energy, tabled Bill 59 in Nova Scotia Legislature, amending the Provincial Petroleum Accord Act for several purposes. First, to prohibit the carrying on of work related to the drilling for petroleum, including exploratory drilling, in or within 1 nautical mile of Sable Island National Park Reserve. Second, to limit the surface access rights provided for under the Accord Act to, among other things, low-impact seismic activity. And third, to set out a process under which the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board must consult with and consider the advice of Parks Canada when considering an application to authorize petroleum-related work or activity in the National Park Reserve. When the proposed provincial bill was referred to its Law Amendments Committee, there was one witness, the Ecology Action Centre, that recommended that the bill be amended to delete the option of conducting low-impact seismic activity on Sable Island. However, Mr. Speaker, the new Democratic government chose not to amend its legislation to delete the reference to low-impact seismic activity. The Nova Scotia legislature followed suit, passing Bill 59 without amendment. On May 10, 2013, the provincial bill was given royal assent. In short, Mr. Speaker, the provincial New Democratic government has passed the legislation called for under the terms of the 2011 National Park Establishment Agreement that was signed by Premier Darrell Dexter and the Federal Minister of Environment and witnessed by Mr. Leonard Pera, the Provincial Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage, and the Honourable Member for Central Nova. The provincial New Democratic government was satisfied with the arrangement and was not prepared to amend its legislation. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia now awaits the outcome of our deliberations to designate Sable Island National Park Reserve under the Canada National Parks Act. Mr. Speaker, I recount this history because, given the concerns expressed over low seismic activity, it is important to accurately outline the work that would be required in the weeks and months ahead should consideration be given to amend S15. as the only means to remedy these concerns. Given that Canada and Nova Scotia passed mirror legislation in 1988 to implement the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Accord, and given that our Bill S-15 and the province's Bill 59 have developed mirror legislation to amend these acts to implement the drilling ban and to limit seismic activity to low impact, and given that Nova Scotia has passed its Bill 59 without amendment, the implication for our work is clear. Should we decide to amend Bill S-15, additional work will need to be undertaken. The provincial New Democratic government will have to decide whether it is prepared to once again amend its Provincial Accord Act, this time to delete or amend references to seismic activity. While I cannot speak for the provincial New Democratic government, it is clear that in negotiating the National Park Establishment Agreement and in rejecting a prior recommendation to alter the seismic activity reference, they are supportive of the current approach. Additional consultations will also have to be undertaken with the petroleum industry to determine their views on such a change. Again, while I cannot speak for the industry, it would seem to me that given the petroleum activity within the broader Sable Basin will continue, Industry and Offshore Petroleum Board will require the most accurate seismic data in order to reduce the exploration risk when drilling expensive offshore oil and gas wells. Mr. Speaker, allow me to offer a few observations on the issue of low-impact seismic activity. It's my understanding that the Offshore Petroleum Board has indicated to Parks Canada that it is currently not aware of a need for additional seismic data to be collected on Sable Island. However, these needs may very well change in the future. In addition, should a company seek an authorization to collect new data from Sable Island, the board would require justification from the company that the current seismic information is not sufficient and that information could not be gathered beyond the National Parks Reserve. Failing the above, the board would also seek from the company assurances that other, less intrusive techniques could not be used to augment the existing seismic information. Finally, Mr. Speaker, if after all this had been clearly demonstrated that a seismic program placing equipment on Sable Island was required, an environmental assessment would be conducted under the policy of the Offshore Petroleum Board. Such assessments would have to meet the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act standard of determining the likelihood of an activity to cause significant adverse environmental effects. And given the requirement of S-15 that the board seek the advice of Parks Canada on such a proposed authorization, Parks Canada would clearly have an opportunity to influence the nature of any proposed seismic undertaking. Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the in-depth discussions that will ensue at committee on these and other issues related to the designation of Sable Island as a National Park Reserve. And I trust that clarity will be brought to the issues that have been raised in this chamber. Mr. Speaker, I would like to address one other major concern that has been expressed during this debate. The notion that Bill S-15 will undermine the integrity of our internationally renowned national park system. The concern focuses on the suggestion that by continuing to allow Offshore Petroleum Board to authorize seismic activity, although S-15 proposes to limit that authorization to low impact, we are somehow setting a precedent for other national parks across Canada, as well as for future national parks. Well, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate these concerns. It speaks to the nonpartisan support that exists in the House for the desirability to protect our nationally significant lands and waters in protected national parks for the benefit of present and future generations. It speaks to the actions that Parliament has taken over the decades, indeed spanning the last 3 centuries, since 1885, when it created Banff National Park, to set aside forever iconic landscapes and their resident plant and animal species. However, as the Parliamentary Secretary for the Environment made clear in her remarks last Thursday, we are giving effect to the drilling ban and to limiting seismic activity to low impact by amending the Offshore Petroleum Accord Implementation Act, not the National Parks Act. We are not introducing any changes whatsoever to the Canada National Parks Act that could be remotely interpreted as allowing seismic activity in any other existing national park. I cannot be clearer on this point, Mr. Speaker. It will not be allowed in Olivec National Park or Yoho National Park or any other national park in between. I would also like to make clear, Mr. Speaker, that we are not amending the Canada National Parks Act to permit low-impact seismic activity on Sable Island. Seismic activity is already allowed on Sable Island. We are amending the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resources Accord Implementation Act to restrict any future seismic work to low impact on Sable Island. Thus, it will only be within Sable Island National Park Reserve that at some future date, the Offshore Petroleum Board may authorize low-impact seismic activity. Mr. Speaker, through Bill S-15, we are enhancing the integrity of our national park system. We are bringing the highest level of federal legislative protection to Sable Island as a national park reserve. As the Parliamentary Secretary also made clear, when we negotiate for the creation of new national parks, we are often challenged to consider whether or not to allow certain activities to continue on a case-by-case basis. For the most part, Mr. Speaker, we are able to achieve a new national park that respects the Act and that is completely true to the best of our intentions. But sometimes that is just not possible. And simple reality is no reason to completely abandon the idea of designating an area a national park. Mr. Speaker, I would remind this House that it was only in 2009 that Parliament passed legislation authorizing the permitting of several mineral access roads through the expanded Nahanni National Park Reserve. This was no doubt a difficult decision, but one that made possible a six-fold expansion of Nahanni, producing what was referred to as the greatest conservation decision of this generation. I trust that as we move forward with S-15, that we will balance our duty to maintain the integrity of our national park system with the opportunity to finally provide Sable Island with a level of protection and conservation framework that has been called for the past 50 years. Mr. Speaker, with this approach in Bill S-15 to balance the conservation and development needs of Sable Island with the broader Nova Scotia offshore needs, with the balancing the goals of the Offshore Petroleum Accord Act with the Canada National Parks Act, we are achieving real conservation gains for Sable Island. If I may paraphrase the Honourable Minister of Environment from his remarks last Thursday night, through Bill S-15, we are accomplishing the following: a new National Park Reserve for Sable Island, Canada's 43rd national park; the application of a comprehensive conservation framework to Sable Island for the first time in 50 years; a legislative ban that for the first time will prohibit all exploratory and development drilling for petroleum resources from the surface of Sable Island; the creation of a legislative buffer zone around Sable Island that will prohibit drilling out to 1 nautical mile; a prohibition on the extraction of non-petroleum resources from beneath the surface of Sable Island; a limit on the number of petroleum-related activities that can be authorized by the Offshore Petroleum Board in Sable Island National Park Reserve; limiting the current ability of Offshore Petroleum Board to authorize any seismic activity on Sable Island to low-impact activity; providing a legislative requirement for the Offshore Petroleum Board to seek and consider advice from Parks Canada should it choose to authorize activities listed in Bill S-15; developing a management plan within 5 years that will direct the necessary measures to protect Sable Island, to enable visitor experiences that respect the fragility of the island, and to forge partnerships with interested stakeholders. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to the Minister of the Environment, the Minister of Natural Resources Canada, the Ministry of Fishery and Oceans Canada, and the Parliamentary Secretary for the Environment for their dedicated leadership on collaboratively developing legislation that will enable the creation of Sable Island National Park Reserve as Canada's 43rd national park. It's their leadership that has brought this legislation before us today. Now it's up to this chamber to complete our business to ensure that Sable Island will be forever protected, so that future generations, whether they choose to visit it or not, will know that this Parliament took action to ensure that the natural and cultural values of this place persist forever. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.